I walked into Meridian Industries that Tuesday morning expecting another day of Marcus Blackwood's verbal abuse. Instead, I found myself holding a certified letter that would change everything. The return address read, Blackwood Estate Legal Services, and the contents revealed a truth that would bring the most arrogant CEO in San Francisco to his knees. 6 weeks later, Marcus was begging me not to destroy the company his family had built. But let me start from the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The elevator to the 32nd floor felt like a death march every morning, carrying me toward another day of psychological warfare disguised as employment. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who'd aged 5 years in the past 18 months. Dark circles under brown eyes that had once sparkled with ambition. Auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched my increasingly severe demeanor. At 28, I should have been climbing the corporate ladder, not cowering under the weight of constant humiliation. Meridian Industries occupied 3 floors of the prestigious Embarcadero Tower, its glass walls offering stunning views of San Francisco Bay that I rarely had time to appreciate. The company specialized in high-end architectural consulting, working with tech giants and luxury developers to create the kind of buildings that defined modern skylines. It was exactly the kind of place I'd dreamed of working when I graduated from Berkeley with my master's in structural engineering, exactly the kind of opportunity that should have launched my career into orbit. Instead, it had become my personal hell, thanks to Marcus Blackwood. The receptionist, Janet, gave me a sympathetic smile as I passed her desk. She'd witnessed enough of Marcus's tirades to know what my days looked like, though company policy prevented her from offering anything more than silent support. The open floor plan meant that Marcus's verbal assaults were public entertainment for the entire office, a fact he seemed to relish. My cubicle sat in the far corner, deliberately positioned to maximize my isolation from the rest of the team. The desk was cluttered with project files that Marcus had dumped on me the previous evening, each one marked with increasingly impossible deadlines. The Peterson Mall renovation needed structural analysis by noon. The Riverside Towers project required complete foundation calculations by end of day. The Morrison Tech campus demanded a full seismic assessment by tomorrow morning, all tasks that should have taken a team of engineers a week to complete properly. All tasks that Marcus knew I'd have to work through the night to finish. All tasks designed to set me up for failure, so he could justify his next round of psychological torture. I'd barely settled into my chair when his voice cut across the office like a blade. "Chen, my office! Now!" Every conversation in the bullpen stopped. 20 pairs of eyes tracked my walk across the floor toward the corner office, with floor-to-ceiling windows that Marcus had claimed despite having no actual engineering credentials. He'd inherited his position as CEO when his father stepped down 2 years ago, a fact that everyone in the company knew but nobody discussed openly. The office itself was a monument to ego, filled with awards he hadn't earned, degrees from prestigious universities paid for by family money, and photographs of him with politicians and celebrities who probably couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Behind his massive mahogany desk hung a portrait of his grandfather, the founder of Meridian Industries, a man whose reputation for integrity stood in stark contrast to his grandson's character. Marcus didn't look up from his computer as I entered, a power play he'd perfected during his brief tenure as CEO. At 35, he maintained the kind of artificial perfection that money could buy, designer suits that cost more than my monthly salary, perfectly styled, blonde hair that never seemed to move despite San Francisco's notorious wind, and the kind of tan that came from weekend trips to private resorts rather than honest work. "Close the door," he said without lifting his eyes from the screen. "We need to discuss your recent performance issues." Performance issues. The phrase had become his favorite weapon, a catch-all justification for any abuse he wanted to inflict. I closed the door and remained standing, having learned that sitting down only gave him a better angle to tower over me during his verbal assaults. "The Morrison project analysis you submitted yesterday was completely inadequate," he continued, finally looking up with those cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the exact amount of damage each word would inflict. "The foundation specifications are wrong, the seismic calculations are off by at least 15%, and your timeline projections are laughably optimistic." I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. The Morrison analysis had taken me 3 sleepless nights to complete, double-checking every calculation, cross-referencing every specification with current building codes, consulting with seismic experts to ensure absolute accuracy. It was some of the best work I'd ever produced, and we both knew it. Mr. Blackwood, I reviewed those calculations multiple times. The foundation specifications meet all current standards, and the seismic analysis follows the most recent geological survey data for that area of the city. If you could point out specifically which, are you questioning my expertise? His voice dropped to that dangerous whisper he used when he was about to escalate. Are you suggesting that I don't know what I'm talking about? The question was a trap, and we both knew it. If I backed down, I'd be admitting that my work was substandard. If I stood my ground, he'd use my insubordination as justification for even worse treatment. I'd played this game enough times to know there was no winning move. I'm simply asking for clarification so I can improve the analysis to meet your standards, I said carefully, keeping my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was enjoying this, feeding off my carefully controlled frustration like some kind of emotional vampire. You want clarification? Here's your clarification, Chen. Your work is consistently below the standards we expect at Meridian Industries. Your attention to detail is lacking, your technical knowledge is outdated, and frankly, your attitude has become a problem. Each word was carefully chosen for maximum impact, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he'd practiced this speech. I'd heard variations of it dozens of times over the past 18 months, but somehow it still managed to hit its target. Furthermore, he continued, warming to his theme, your inability to work effectively with the rest of the team has become disruptive to our overall productivity. Several colleagues have expressed concerns about your collaborative skills. That was a lie, and he knew it. The few colleagues who still dared to interact with me had been nothing but supportive, offering quiet encouragement and assistance when they thought Marcus wasn't watching. But contradicting him would only make things worse. I'm beginning to question whether you're the right fit for this organization, Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone of fake regret. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if you considered other opportunities. There it was, the threat he'd been building toward for months. Not quite a firing, which would require documentation and justification, but a suggestion that I should quit voluntarily. Save everyone the embarrassment of a formal termination. Preserve the company's reputation while destroying mine. Mr. Blackwood, I believe my work speaks for itself. The Morrison analysis is technically sound, and I'm confident it meets all industry standards. If there are specific issues you'd like me to address. Specific issues? Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The window. The specific issue is that you're not listening, you're not learning. You're not improving. His voice was rising now, loud enough that I was certain the entire office could hear every word. This was part of his strategy, the public humiliation that accompanied the private psychological warfare. I've given you opportunity after opportunity to prove yourself, and you failed every single time. The Peterson project was late. The Riverside calculations had errors. Now the Morrison analysis is completely inadequate. Do you see a pattern here, Chen? I saw a pattern, all right. A pattern of impossible deadlines, deliberately conflicting requirements, and moving goalposts designed to ensure failure regardless of the quality of my work. But saying that would be career suicide. I understand your concerns, I said instead, hating the way my voice sounded small and defeated. I'm committed to improving my performance and meeting the standards you've outlined. Marcus walked around his desk, positioning himself uncomfortably close to where I stood. It was another intimidation tactic, using his height and physical presence to reinforce the power dynamic between us. Commitment isn't enough anymore, Chen. I need results. Real results. Not excuses, not explanations, not promises to do better. Results. He was close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne, close enough that his proximity felt like a violation. I took a small step backward, and his smile widened slightly. He'd noticed my discomfort and was feeding off it. "The Riverside Towers project is being presented to the board next week," he continued, his voice dropping back to that dangerous whisper. "I'm assigning you to lead the technical presentation. Consider it your final opportunity to prove that you belong at this company." My stomach dropped. The Riverside presentation was a company-defining project. A $50 million development that would establish Meridian's reputation in the luxury residential market. It was the kind of high-stakes assignment that senior engineers with decades of experience competed for. Giving it to me wasn't an opportunity. It was sabotage. "The presentation is in 6 days," Marcus added, returning to his desk with the satisfied air of someone who'd just set a perfect trap. "The board expects a complete structural analysis, seismic assessment, environmental impact study, and cost projections, all documented according to the highest professional standards. 6 days to complete what should have been 6 months of work. 6 days to produce analysis that would be scrutinized by some of the most demanding executives in the construction industry. 6 days to either save my career or watch it explode in the most public way possible." "Any questions?" Marcus asked, though his tone made it clear that questions weren't welcome. "No, Mr. Blackwood. I understand the assignment." "Excellent. I'll expect regular progress updates, and remember, the board has very high standards. They don't tolerate mediocrity, and neither do I." I turned toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of his office, but his voice stopped me before I could reach the handle. "Oh, and Chen? I hope you understand how fortunate you are to receive this opportunity. Not everyone would be given a chance to redeem themselves after such a consistent pattern of failure." The condescension in his voice was so thick, I could practically taste it. He wanted me to thank him, to grovel for the privilege of being set up for public humiliation. I turned back, meeting his eyes with what I hoped looked like professional gratitude rather than barely contained rage. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Blackwood. I won't let you down." His smile was predatory. "I certainly hope not. Because if this presentation doesn't meet our standards, well, I think we both know what the consequences will be." I left his office on unsteady legs, acutely aware that every eye in the bullpen was tracking my movement. The whispered conversations that had stopped when Marcus started shouting resumed at a lower volume, and I caught fragments of sympathetic murmurs from colleagues who understood exactly what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I sat down at my desk, the magnitude of the impossible task ahead of me settling like a weight on my chest. 6 days to produce a presentation that would either save my career or end it. 6 days to prove that I belonged in a company where I'd never been welcome. 6 days to satisfy the standards of a man who'd made it clear that nothing I did would ever be good enough. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank document that would become the Riverside analysis, wondering how I'd managed to let my life reach this point. 2 years ago, I'd been a rising star in structural engineering, recruited by 3 different firms, confident in my abilities and optimistic about my future. Now I was trapped in a psychological war with a man who seemed to take genuine pleasure in my suffering. The worst part wasn't the impossible workload or the public humiliation. The worst part was how it had changed me. I'd started second-guessing my own expertise, questioning decisions I would have made confidently just months before. Marcus's constant criticism had planted seeds of doubt that grew stronger with each encounter, each impossible deadline, each moment of manufactured failure. I'd tried everything to improve the situation. I'd worked longer hours, produced better analysis, attempted to anticipate his criticism before he could voice it. I'd researched his background, looking for common ground or shared interests that might humanize me in his eyes. I'd even considered going to HR, though everyone knew that complaints about Marcus mysteriously disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Nothing worked because nothing was supposed to work. The cruelty was the point, the psychological warfare was intentional, and my suffering was entertainment. Marcus had turned the destruction of my confidence into a hobby, and he was very good at it. My computer chimed with an incoming email, and I saw Marcus's name in the sender field. Even though I'd just left his office, he was already following up with written documentation of our conversation. The subject line read, "Performance Improvement Plan, Final Warning." The email was a masterpiece of corporate manipulation, carefully worded to create a paper trail that would justify my termination while protecting the company from any potential legal action. It outlined my supposed performance deficiencies in clinical detail, established the Riverside presentation as a final test of my competence, and included language about mutual agreement to part ways if standards weren't met. I read it twice, marveling at how Marcus had managed to make psychological abuse sound like constructive feedback. Every criticism was phrased in terms of objective professional standards. Every impossible demand was presented as a reasonable accommodation to help me succeed. Every threat was disguised as an opportunity for growth and development. The genius of it was that on paper, Marcus appeared to be a patient manager, giving an underperforming employee every possible chance to improve. The reality of his sadistic pleasure in my torment was invisible in the formal language of corporate communication. I was still staring at the email when Janet appeared beside my desk, moving with the casual stealth that receptionists develop when they need to deliver sensitive information without attracting attention. "There's a delivery for you at the front desk," she said quietly. "Certified mail from some law firm. Looks important." Certified mail was never good news, especially not at work. My first thought was that Marcus had somehow arranged for legal action, perhaps a formal notice of termination dressed up in official language. My second thought was that one of my student loans had gone into default, though I'd been religiously making payments despite my increasingly dire financial situation. I followed Janet to the reception area, trying to ignore the curious looks from colleagues who were undoubtedly wondering what fresh disaster was about to befall me. The envelope was thick and expensive looking, with the kind of letterhead that suggested serious legal business. "Blackwood Estate Legal Services," I read aloud, and Janet's eyebrows shot up. "Blackwood? Like our Marcus Blackwood?" I shrugged, equally puzzled. Must be a coincidence. Common enough name. But as I returned to my desk with the unopened envelope, I couldn't shake the feeling that coincidences were rare in my line of work. Everything had a cause. Every effect had an origin. And the timing of legal correspondence arriving just hours after Marcus's latest psychological assault felt suspicious. I opened the envelope carefully, half expecting some kind of legal threat or cease and desist notice. Instead, I found a cover letter signed by someone named Harrison Blackwood, senior partner, followed by several pages of official-looking documentation. "Dear Miss Chen," the letter began, "I am writing to inform you of a matter that may be of significant interest to you regarding the estate of my recently deceased brother, Theodore Blackwood." Theodore Blackwood. The name meant nothing to me, but the formal language of the letter suggested this was serious business. I continued reading, my confusion growing with each paragraph. "During the administration of Theodore's estate, we discovered documentation indicating that you may be the beneficiary of certain assets and interests that were not previously known to our family. Specifically, Theodore appears to have made provisions for you in a private codicil to his will that was only recently discovered among his personal papers." I read the sentence 3 times before the words started to make sense. A codicil was a legal amendment to a will. I knew that much from watching legal dramas. But the idea that someone named Theodore Blackwood had left me anything was absurd. I'd never heard of the man, had no connection to anyone with that surname, except for my tormentor upstairs. The assets in question include a controlling interest in Meridian Industries, valued at approximately $47 million, as well as various subsidiary holdings and investment portfolios. We would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you at your earliest convenience to discuss these matters and verify your identity. The words swam before my eyes as the full implications hit me like a physical blow. Controlling interest in Meridian Industries. The company where I worked, where Marcus Blackwood ruled like a petty tyrant, where I'd spent 18 months being systematically destroyed. Someone named Theodore Blackwood had left me control of the company. And if Theodore was related to Marcus, which seemed increasingly likely given the shared surname and the law firm's obvious connection to the family, then Marcus had no idea that the woman he'd been torturing was about to become his boss. I read the letter a fourth time, looking for any indication that this was some kind of elaborate prank or mistake. But the letterhead was legitimate, the legal language was precise, and the contact information included a prestigious downtown address that I recognized as one of the city's most expensive legal districts. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from humiliation or fear. This time it was from the sudden rush of possibility. The intoxicating prospect of justice served in the most poetic way imaginable. Marcus Blackwood, who'd made my life a living hell, who'd taken pleasure in my suffering, who'd used his inherited position to torment someone he saw as powerless, was about to discover that power had shifted in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. I looked around the office with new eyes, seeing not a prison but a kingdom that might soon be mine to rule. The impossible deadlines, the psychological warfare, the constant humiliation, all of it was about to be turned on its head in the most spectacular way possible. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to know who Theodore Blackwood was, why he'd left me anything, and, most importantly, whether this incredible stroke of fortune was real or some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. I reached for my phone to call the number on the letterhead, then stopped. This conversation was too important, too potentially life-changing, to have in the middle of the office where Marcus or his allies might overhear. I needed privacy, I needed time to think, and I needed to understand exactly what weapons I'd just been handed. The Riverside presentation suddenly seemed like a distant concern. 6 days had transformed from a countdown to career destruction into a countdown to the most satisfying revenge in corporate history. I slipped the letter into my purse and opened my laptop, pretending to work on the structural analysis while my mind raced through the possibilities. For the first time in 18 months, I was looking forward to Monday morning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of faked productivity and suppressed excitement. Every time Marcus emerged from his office, every time his voice carried across the bullpen, every time he shot me one of his contemptuous looks, I had to bite back a smile. The man who'd made himself my nemesis had no idea that the balance of power had just shifted so dramatically that it would make his head spin. I left the office at exactly 5:30, earlier than I'd departed in months, ignoring the surprised looks from colleagues who'd grown accustomed to my increasingly desperate attempts to stay ahead of impossible deadlines. Tonight, for the first time in forever, I had somewhere more important to be than chained to my desk. The law offices of Blackwood Estate Legal Services occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming tower in the financial district, the kind of building that radiated money and power from every polished surface. I'd called from my car and somehow managed to schedule an emergency consultation for 7 o'clock, though I suspected that the mention of Theodore Blackwood's estate had opened doors that normally remained closed. Harrison Blackwood turned out to be a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of handling other people's money. His office was a study in understated elegance, filled with antique furniture and original artwork that probably cost more than my annual salary. "Miss Chen," he said, rising from behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, have a seat." I settled into a leather chair that was more comfortable than my bed, trying to project confidence despite feeling completely out of my depth. This was a world I'd never inhabited, a level of wealth and power that existed in a different universe from my cubicle at Meridian Industries. "I have to admit, Mr. Blackwood, I'm completely puzzled by your letter. I've never heard of Theodore Blackwood, and I can't imagine why he would have left me anything." Harrison nodded, opening a thick file folder that sat on his desk. "That's understandable. And frankly, we were equally surprised when we discovered Theodore's codicil. My brother was a very private man, especially in his later years. He made many decisions without consulting the family, much to our ongoing frustration." Brother. So Harrison and Theodore were siblings, which meant they were probably related to Marcus as well. The family dynamics were becoming more complex, but the central fact remained unchanged. Someone in the Blackwood family had left me a fortune, and I was fairly certain it wasn't an accident. "Could you tell me a bit about your background, Miss Chen, your education, your career, how you came to work at Meridian Industries?" I gave him a condensed version of my professional history, From my undergraduate degree at Stanford through my master's at Berkeley, my early career successes, and my current position at Meridian. I was careful not to mention Marcus or the ongoing psychological warfare, focusing instead on my technical qualifications and project experience. Harrison listened intently, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. Theodore founded Meridian Industries in 1987, he said. Built it from nothing into one of the most respected architectural consulting firms on the West Coast. He was passionate about engineering excellence, about finding and nurturing the best technical talent regardless of their background or connections. Something clicked in my mind. He founded Meridian, but I thought Marcus's grandfather started the company. Harrison's expression darkened slightly. That would be my father, Theodore's father-in-law. The family history is complicated, Ms. Chen. Theodore married my sister Margaret, and when father died, Theodore inherited the company. When Margaret passed away 5 years ago, Theodore became increasingly isolated from the rest of us. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Theodore was Marcus's stepfather, not his biological father. That explained the family tension, and possibly Theodore's decision to bypass Marcus in his estate planning. Theodore had very strong opinions about merit versus inheritance, Harrison continued. He believed that leadership positions should be earned through competence and character, not handed down through family connections. This philosophy occasionally put him at odds with other family members who had different expectations. I thought about Marcus. With his purchased degrees and inherited position, his complete lack of technical expertise, and his talent for psychological manipulation, it wasn't hard to imagine conflicts between him and a man who valued engineering excellence above family loyalty. Did Theodore know about my work at Meridian? I asked. I believe he followed the company's projects quite closely, even after his retirement. He maintained relationships with several senior engineers, and he occasionally reviewed project documentation to ensure that standards were being maintained. Which meant Theodore had probably seen my work, had evaluated my technical competence, and had reached conclusions about the quality of my engineering that stood in stark contrast to Marcus's constant criticism. Mr. Blackwood, I need to understand exactly what I'm inheriting here. Your letter mentioned a controlling interest in Meridian Industries. What does that mean in practical terms? Harrison smiled for the first time since I'd entered his office. It means, Ms. Chen, that as of the reading of Theodore's will next Monday, you will own 51% of Meridian Industries. You will be the majority shareholder, the chairman of the board, and effectively the owner of the company. The room seemed to spin slightly as the full implications hit me. Not just an employee, not just a board member, but the actual owner of the company, where I'd been systematically tormented for 18 months. What about Marcus? What's his position in all this? Marcus inherited his title when Theodore stepped down as CEO 2 years ago, but he was never given ownership shares. Theodore was very specific about separating operational control from ownership, partly because he had concerns about Marcus's long-term suitability for leadership. Concerns about Marcus's suitability. That was probably the most diplomatic way to describe what Theodore had observed about his stepson's character and competence. There's more, Harrison continued, pulling out another set of documents. Theodore's estate also includes approximately $12 million in liquid assets, a portfolio of investment properties worth another $15 million, and various other holdings that bring the total inheritance to just over $74 million. $74 million. The number was so large that my brain couldn't quite process it. 6 hours ago, I'd been worried about making rent. Now I was being told that I was worth more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Why me? I asked, the question that had been nagging at me since I'd first read the letter. I never even met Theodore Blackwood. Why would he leave everything to a complete stranger? Harrison's expression became thoughtful, almost sad. Theodore left very detailed notes explaining his reasoning. He'd been monitoring Meridian's projects for the past 2 years, and he'd become increasingly concerned about the direction of the company under Marcus's leadership. He was particularly disturbed by reports he'd received about the treatment of talented employees. My stomach clenched. Theodore had known about Marcus's behavior, had been aware of the psychological warfare and professional sabotage. He made several discreet inquiries about you specifically, Miss Chen. Your technical work, your professional reputation, your character references from colleagues and former supervisors. Everything he learned convinced him that you represented the kind of engineering excellence and personal integrity that Meridian Industries needed to maintain its reputation. So it wasn't random. Theodore had researched me, had evaluated my qualifications, and had made a deliberate decision to entrust his life's work to someone he believed could restore the company's values. There's one more thing, Harrison said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Theodore was very specific about the timing of this inheritance. He wanted you to have the opportunity to observe Marcus's leadership style and the company's current culture before assuming control. He believed that understanding the problems would be essential to implementing solutions. Understanding the problems. I'd certainly done that, though at considerable personal cost. 18 months of psychological torture had given me an intimate understanding of exactly what was wrong with Meridian Industries under Marcus's leadership. When does this become official? I asked. The will reading is scheduled for Monday morning at 10 o'clock. All family members and major beneficiaries are required to attend. That includes you, Marcus, and several other relatives who have smaller stakes in the estate. Monday morning, 4 days from now. 4 days to prepare for a confrontation that would reshape not just my life, but the entire power structure of the company, where I'd been systematically destroyed. Mr. Blackwood, I need to ask you something directly. Does Marcus know anything about this inheritance? Nothing at all. Theodore was very specific about maintaining secrecy until the formal reading. Marcus believes he's the primary beneficiary of the estate, given his position as CEO and his role as Theodore's stepson. Marcus thought he was about to inherit everything. He probably assumed that Theodore's death would cement his control over Meridian Industries, would give him the ownership stake to match his operational authority. The revelation that everything was going to the woman he'd been tormenting would be a shock that I could barely imagine. What happens at the will reading? How does the transfer of ownership actually work? It's fairly straightforward from a legal perspective. The ownership shares transfer immediately upon the reading of the will. You'll need to sign some documentation, but you'll walk out of that conference room as the majority owner of Meridian Industries. I sat in silence for a moment, trying to process the magnitude of what was about to happen. In 4 days, I would go from being the victim of workplace psychological abuse to being the owner of the company, with the power to fire the man who'd made my life hell. Ms. Chen, I should mention that Theodore left some specific guidance about how he hoped you would handle your new responsibilities. He was very concerned about Meridian's reputation and the welfare of its employees. He hoped that you would consider not just your own justice, but the broader impact of your decisions on innocent people who depend on the company for their livelihoods. That was a sobering reminder. My personal vendetta against Marcus was one thing, but Meridian Industries employed over 200 people, many of whom had families and mortgages and dreams that depended on the company's continued success. Whatever revenge I planned would need to consider their welfare as well. I understand, I said. Theodore built something important, and he's entrusting me to preserve that legacy while correcting the problems he identified. Exactly. He believed that you had both the technical competence and the personal character to lead Meridian Industries into its next phase of growth. He was betting his life's work on that belief. No pressure there. Just the responsibility of honoring a dead man's trust while managing a multi-million-dollar company and dealing with the psychological warfare that Marcus would undoubtedly escalate once he realized what had happened. What about the other family members? How are they likely to react to this news? Harrison's expression grew grim. There will be challenges, Ms. Chen. Several family members expected to inherit substantial portions of Theodore's estate. Some may attempt to contest the will, though I believe Theodore's documentation is thorough enough to withstand legal challenges. And Marcus specifically? Marcus has been counting on this inheritance to resolve some significant financial pressures. He's made some poor personal investments over the past 2 years, borrowed against his expectations of inheriting the company. This news will be devastating to him both personally and financially. Poor financial decisions explained a lot about Marcus's increasingly desperate behavior over the past few months. The pressure to maintain his lifestyle while managing a company he wasn't qualified to run had probably been eating at him, making him even more vicious toward perceived weak targets. Mr. Blackwood, I need to be completely honest with you about something. Marcus has been systematically abusing his position as CEO to make my life miserable. He's given me impossible deadlines, publicly humiliated me, and created a hostile work environment that's been destroying my confidence and my health. Harrison nodded grimly. Theodore suspected as much. It was one of the factors that influenced his decision to restructure his estate planning. He was particularly concerned about reports of talented employees being driven away from the company. What I'm saying is that when Monday comes, when Marcus discovers what's happened, this isn't going to be a polite corporate transition. This is going to be personal, and it's going to be ugly. Theodore anticipated that as well. He left very specific instructions about how to handle the transition, including legal protections for you and recommendations for managing Marcus's inevitable resistance. I spent another hour going through the details of the inheritance, signing preliminary documents, and learning about the various legal protections that Theodore had put in place. By the time I left Harrison's office, I had a much clearer picture of what Monday would bring and what responsibilities I was about to inherit. The drive home gave me time to think about the incredible reversal of fortune that was about to transform my life. 24 hours ago, I'd been trapped in a cycle of abuse and humiliation, counting down to what I assumed would be the end of my career. Now I was 4 days away from becoming one of the most powerful people in San Francisco's engineering community. But with that power came responsibility, both to Theodore's legacy and to the innocent people who would be affected by whatever decisions I made. Revenge against Marcus was certainly deserved, but it needed to be balanced against the broader mission of restoring Meridian Industries to the standards of excellence that Theodore had built. I thought about Monday morning, about walking into that conference room where Marcus would expect to inherit everything, and instead discovering that his primary victim had become his boss. The look on his face would be worth 18 months of psychological torture all by itself. But beyond the personal satisfaction of seeing Marcus get his comeuppance, there was the larger question of what kind of leader I wanted to be. Theodore had chosen me not just because I'd been wronged, but because he believed I had the character and competence to lead his company into the future. That meant I needed to be more than just an agent of revenge. I needed to be a force for positive change, someone who could restore Meridian's culture while maintaining its technical excellence. The woman who walked into that will reading on Monday needed to be ready not just to claim her inheritance, but to earn it through the decisions she made afterward. Friday morning arrived with a mix of anticipation and dread that made it impossible to concentrate on anything resembling normal work. The Riverside presentation, which had seemed like such an insurmountable challenge just days before, now felt like a minor annoyance compared to the tectonic shift that was about to occur in my professional life. Marcus was in rare form, apparently energized by the prospect of my imminent failure on the Riverside project. He made 3 separate visits to my cubicle before lunch, each time offering condescending advice about project management and technical standards that he clearly didn't understand himself. "Remember, Chen, the board expects professional quality work," he said during his final visit, loud enough for the entire office to hear. "This isn't some college project where you can fake your way through with flashy presentations and academic theory. These are real clients with real money, and they expect real expertise." I nodded politely, biting back the observation that he wouldn't recognize real expertise if it filed a formal complaint with HR. In 4 days, I would have the power to show him exactly what real expertise looked like when it was backed by controlling ownership of the company. "I understand, Mr. Blackwood. I'm committed to delivering the highest quality analysis." "Good. And remember, this presentation will be a reflection not just on you, but on the entire engineering department. Make sure you understand the responsibility you're carrying." The irony was perfect. Marcus was lecturing me about responsibility, while having no idea that in 96 hours, I would be responsible for the entire company, including his continued employment. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. I spent Saturday morning at the public library, researching everything I could find about corporate governance, hostile takeovers, and the legal rights of majority shareholders. Theodore had left me ownership of the company, but I needed to understand exactly what that ownership meant in practical terms. Sunday was devoted to preparing for the Riverside presentation, though my heart wasn't really in the technical analysis anymore. The structural calculations that had seemed so crucial just days ago now felt like busy work, a distraction from the much larger transformation that was about to occur. Still, I completed the work with my usual thoroughness, partly out of professional pride, and partly because I suspected I might need every example of my technical competence in the corporate battles that lay ahead. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that San Francisco delivered on its best days, the fog retreating to reveal a city that sparkled with possibility. I dressed more carefully than usual, choosing a charcoal gray suit that projected authority without appearing overly formal. If today went according to plan, it would be the last day I dressed to please Marcus Blackwood's expectations of appropriate workplace attire. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Harrison Blackwood's downtown office, which meant I needed to arrive at Meridian Industries early enough to maintain my normal routine without arousing suspicion. The last thing I wanted was for Marcus to become curious about my activities on what he assumed would be just another Monday of his psychological warfare campaign. I reached my cubicle at 7:30, earlier than my usual arrival time, but not so early as to attract attention. The office was nearly empty, occupied only by a handful of junior engineers who'd arrived early to work on project deadlines, without the distraction of phones and meetings. The quiet gave me time to organize my thoughts and review the notes I'd taken during my Friday evening consultation with Harrison. Marcus arrived at 8:15, his BMW pulling into the reserved parking space that came with his inherited position as CEO. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched him emerge from the car with his usual swagger, designer briefcase in hand, ready to begin another day of ruling his small corporate kingdom. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, that kingdom would belong to someone else entirely. He made his usual rounds through the office, checking on projects and delivering casual criticism to anyone unfortunate enough to catch his attention. I kept my head down and focused on reviewing the Riverside presentation materials, playing the role of the dedicated employee frantically trying to meet impossible standards. At 9:30, I made my excuses about needing to visit a client site for additional measurements, a lie that would explain my absence during the will reading without arousing suspicion. Marcus barely looked up from his computer when I mentioned it, probably assuming that I was making a last desperate attempt to salvage the Riverside project. "Make sure you're back by 2, he said dismissively. "We need to discuss your presentation strategy, and I want to review your preliminary findings before you embarrass yourself in front of the board." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. I'll be back well before then." The drive to Harrison's office took me through the heart of San Francisco's financial district, past the gleaming towers where some of the world's largest corporations made decisions that affected millions of lives. In an hour I would join their ranks, though I suspected my path to power had been considerably more unusual than most. Harrison's conference room was even more impressive than his office, dominated by a mahogany table that could easily seat 20 people. Original oil paintings lined the walls, and the windows offered spectacular views of the bay that reminded me why San Francisco commanded some of the highest real estate prices in the world. I arrived a few minutes early, wanting to compose myself before facing whatever family drama was about to unfold. Harrison greeted me with professional warmth, though I detected an undercurrent of tension that suggested he was as uncertain about the coming confrontation as I was. "The family should be arriving shortly," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the head of the table. Theodore was quite specific about the seating arrangements, actually. He wanted you positioned where everyone could see your reactions clearly. Even in death, Theodore was orchestrating the drama of this moment. I wondered what he'd been like in life, whether he'd possessed the same flair for theatrical justice that was about to unfold in this conference room. The Blackwood family began arriving at 5 minutes before 10, and I got my first look at the people who'd expected to inherit Theodore's fortune. Margaret's sister, a severe-looking woman in her 70s who introduced herself as Beatrice, took a seat across from me with the kind of cold assessment that suggested she'd already decided I was an interloper. Her son William, a man about Marcus's age who worked in commercial real estate, nodded politely, but maintained the distant courtesy of someone reserving judgment. Marcus arrived last, precisely at 10 o'clock, striding into the conference room with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to become significantly wealthier. He was impeccably dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, his blonde hair perfectly styled, his expression radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from a lifetime of inherited privilege. He stopped short when he saw me sitting at the table, his confident expression flickering with confusion and annoyance. "What's she doing here?" he asked Harrison, not bothering to acknowledge my presence directly. "This is a family meeting about Theodore's estate." "Ms. Chen is here at Theodore's specific request," Harrison replied smoothly. "She's mentioned in the will, so her presence is required by law." Marcus's jaw tightened, and I could see him running through possibilities in his mind, trying to understand why his stepfather would have mentioned a random employee in his estate planning. The best explanation he could probably manage was that Theodore had left me some small token, perhaps a scholarship fund or a modest financial gift, in recognition of my work at Meridian Industries. "I see," Marcus said, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table from me. "Well, let's get on with it then. Some of us have companies to run." Harrison opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a thick document bound in dark blue covers. The will of Theodore Blackwood, I assumed, the legal instrument that was about to reshape the power dynamics in this room in ways that only Harrison and I currently understood. "Before we begin," Harrison said, "I want to remind everyone that Theodore's wishes were very specific and carefully considered. He spent considerable time with his legal advisors, ensuring that his estate planning reflected his values and his assessment of what would be best for his various business interests." Beatrice sniffed disapprovingly. "Theodore always was overly dramatic about these things. I assume he's left the bulk of the estate to Marcus, as any reasonable person would expect." "We'll review all the provisions systematically," Harrison replied diplomatically. Theodore wanted to ensure that everyone understood not just what they were receiving, but why he made the decisions he did. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone preparing to receive good news. He probably assumed that the presence of other family members was just a formality, that Theodore had left token amounts to various relatives while giving him the controlling interest in Meridian Industries and the bulk of the financial assets. Harrison began reading the formal legal language that opened the will, the standard provisions about sound mind and legal capacity that established Theodore's competence to make these decisions. It was dry, procedural stuff that everyone endured while waiting to get to the important details about who was getting what. The first substantive provisions dealt with Theodore's personal property and smaller financial bequests. Beatrice received the family vacation home in Napa Valley, worth approximately $2 million. William inherited a portfolio of municipal bonds valued at $1.5 million. Several other relatives received amounts ranging from $50,000 to $500,000. Marcus listened to these distributions with growing impatience, clearly eager to move past the minor bequests and get to the main event. He probably assumed that Theodore was saving the best for last, building suspense before announcing that his stepson would inherit the crown jewel of the estate. "Now we come to the provisions regarding Meridian Industries," Harrison said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. Theodore was very specific about his reasoning for these decisions, and he left detailed explanations that I'll read in their entirety. Marcus straightened in his chair, his expression shifting to one of focused attention. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the official confirmation that he would become not just the CEO, but the owner of the company his stepfather had built. "Theodore wrote the following," Harrison continued, his voice carrying clearly through the conference room. "Meridian Industries represents 40 years of my professional life and the embodiment of my beliefs about engineering excellence and ethical business practices. The future leadership of this company will determine whether those values survive or whether they are abandoned in favor of short-term profits and personal advancement." I kept my expression carefully neutral, though I could feel Marcus's growing excitement radiating from across the table. He probably interpreted Theodore's emphasis on values and ethics as validation of his own leadership style. "I have observed with growing concern the direction of Meridian Industries under its current management," Harrison read. "Reports from employees, clients, and industry colleagues have convinced me that the company's culture has deteriorated significantly. with talented individuals being driven away through poor leadership and toxic workplace practices. Marcus's confident expression flickered slightly. This wasn't the ringing endorsement he'd expected to hear. Furthermore, I have documented evidence of management decisions that prioritize personal interests over professional competence, including the systematic undermining of qualified employees and the promotion of individuals based on family connections rather than merit. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus was no longer leaning back casually. He was sitting forward now, his hands gripped tightly on the edge of the table. Therefore, Harrison continued, I am leaving my controlling interest in Meridian Industries, representing 51% of the company's outstanding shares, to someone who embodies the technical excellence and personal integrity that the company requires to maintain its reputation and serve its clients effectively. This was it, the moment when Marcus would discover that his world had just turned upside down. I braced myself for his reaction while trying to maintain the surprised expression that someone in my supposed position should display. I leave my controlling interest in Meridian Industries to Ms. Sarah Chen, currently employed as a structural engineer in the company's residential division. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the building. Marcus stared at Harrison as if he'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, his brain apparently unable to process what he'd just heard. That's impossible, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, Harrison replied calmly. Theodore was very clear about this decision, and he left extensive documentation explaining his reasoning. Marcus turned to look at me directly for the first time since entering the conference room, and the expression on his face was a mixture of shock, rage, and complete incomprehension. The woman he'd been systematically tormenting for 18 months had just inherited the company he'd expected to own. This is insane, he said, his voice rising. She's nobody. She's a junior engineer who can't even handle basic project deadlines. Theodore couldn't possibly have intended to give her control of his company. Theodore left very specific reasons for his decision, Harrison said, returning to the document. He wrote, Ms. Chen represents the kind of technical competence and professional character that Meridian Industries needs to thrive in an increasingly competitive market. Her work demonstrates the engineering excellence that has always been the foundation of our success, and her treatment by current management illustrates the toxic culture that threatens to destroy everything we have built. Marcus's face was turning an alarming shade of red. Treatment by current management? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Theodore was aware of your management style, Marcus, Harrison replied carefully. He had concerns about the way certain employees were being treated, and those concerns influenced his estate planning decisions. My management style? Marcus's voice was approaching a shout now. I've been running that company successfully for 2 years. Revenue is up, client satisfaction is strong, and we're positioned for significant growth. And he wants to hand it over to some engineer who can't even complete a presentation on time? Beatrice was staring at me with unconcealed hostility, clearly viewing me as the person responsible for disrupting the family's financial expectations. William looked confused and slightly nauseated, probably calculating how much money the family had just lost to an outsider. There's more, Harrison said, continuing to read from Theodore's will. In addition to the controlling interest in Meridian Industries, I leave to Ms. Chen the sum of $12 million in liquid assets, my investment property portfolio valued at approximately $15 million, and various other holdings detailed in the attached schedules. The total value of my inheritance had just been announced to a room full of people who'd expected to receive that money themselves. The atmosphere was becoming distinctly hostile, and I suspected that maintaining my composure was about to become significantly more challenging. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall. This is fraud, he declared. Theodore was clearly not competent when he made these decisions. No rational person would leave a $47 million company to some random employee over his own family. Theodore's competence was thoroughly documented by multiple physicians, Harrison replied firmly. These decisions were made over a period of several months, with extensive legal consultation and careful consideration of all relevant factors. What factors? Marcus demanded. What possible factors could justify giving away everything our family built to someone who has no connection to us, no understanding of our business, no right to any of this? I decided it was time to speak up. The shocked silence had served its purpose, but now I needed to demonstrate that I was more than just a passive recipient of Theodore's generosity. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, I think I understand the business quite well. I've been working on your projects for 18 months, analyzing your structural specifications, reviewing your client requirements, and observing your management decisions. Marcus whirled to face me, his expression murderous. You've been working for me. Following my instructions, meeting my standards, operating under my direction, that doesn't give you any special insight into running a company. Doesn't it? I asked, allowing a slight smile to play at the corners of my mouth. I've had an excellent opportunity to observe your leadership style, your technical competence, and your decision-making process. Theodore apparently reached some interesting conclusions based on those observations. Quote, my leadership style has produced 2 years of profitable growth, Marcus said through gritted teeth. My technical competence has satisfied every client we've served. My decision-making process has positioned Meridian Industries for long-term success. Your leadership style, I replied calmly, has created a hostile work environment that's driven away some of the most talented engineers in the industry. Your technical competence consists mainly of taking credit for other people's work while contributing nothing of substance to actual project development. And your decision-making process prioritizes your personal interests over the company's long-term reputation. The room erupted. Marcus began shouting about ingratitude and incompetence. Beatrice demanded to know who I thought I was to speak to her nephew that way. William started asking Harrison about the legal procedures for contesting a will. Through it all, Harrison remained calm, occasionally consulting his notes and allowing the family to vent their shock and outrage. He'd probably been through similar scenes before, given his decades of experience with high-stakes estate planning. But I suspected that few will readings had featured quite this level of personal animosity between the beneficiary and the disinherited parties. If I could have everyone's attention, Harrison said finally, his voice cutting through the chaos. There are additional provisions that you need to hear. Marcus sat back down, his face still flushed with anger, but his expression suggesting that he was beginning to accept the reality of what had happened. The inheritance was real, the legal documents were valid, and his expectation of owning Meridian Industries had just been shattered by the most unlikely person imaginable. Theodore was aware that his estate planning decisions would create conflict, Harrison continued. He left specific instructions for managing the transition and protecting the interests of both the company and the affected family members. He turned to a new section of the will, marked with a blue tab that suggested Theodore had considered this part particularly important. Marcus, you will continue as CEO of Meridian Industries for a probationary period of 6 months, during which your performance will be evaluated by the new ownership. If your leadership meets the standards established by Ms. Chen and the board of directors, your position will be confirmed permanently. If not, you will be terminated with a severance package equivalent to 1 year's salary. Marcus's expression went from angry to calculating. 6 months to prove himself, to demonstrate that he could work effectively under new ownership, to possibly salvage his career from the wreckage of his shattered inheritance expectations. Furthermore, Harrison read, Theodore has established a trust fund that will provide Marcus with an annual income of $200,000 for the next 10 years, provided he maintains professional conduct and refrains from any attempts to undermine or interfere with Meridian Industries' operations. $200,000 a year was generous, probably more than Marcus could earn anywhere else given his limited qualifications. But it came with strings attached, behavioral requirements that would force him to abandon the toxic management style that had made my life miserable. What defines professional conduct? Marcus asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. The trust document is quite specific, Harrison replied. No hostile actions against Meridian Industries or its employees, no attempts to solicit clients or employees for competing firms, no public statements that could damage the company's reputation, and compliance with all workplace policies regarding respectful treatment of colleagues. In other words, Marcus would have to stop being Marcus if he wanted to keep receiving money from Theodore's estate. The psychological warfare, the public humiliation, the systematic undermining of subordinates, all of it would have to end if he wanted to maintain his financial security. And if he violates these conditions? I asked, curious about what enforcement mechanisms Theodore had put in place. The trust fund terminates immediately, and he forfeits any claim to future payments, Harrison explained. Theodore was very clear that this arrangement requires genuine behavioral change, not just temporary compliance. Marcus was staring at the table, probably running through his options and realizing that none of them were particularly appealing. He could contest the will, but Harrison had already indicated that Theodore's legal documentation was thorough. He could quit Meridian Industries in protest, but that would cost him both his salary and the trust fund income. Or he could swallow his pride and try to work under the supervision of the woman he'd been tormenting. "I need some time to process this," Marcus said finally. "This is a lot to absorb, and I need to understand exactly what my options are." "Of course," Harrison replied. "But I should mention that the ownership transfer is effective immediately. Ms. Chen, you'll need to sign some documentation, but you are now the majority shareholder and chairman of the board of Meridian Industries." I signed the papers with hands that were surprisingly steady, considering that I was formalizing my transformation from victim to owner in the span of a few pen strokes. Each signature felt like a small act of revolution, a tiny rebellion against 18 months of systematic abuse. As the meeting broke up, the family members filed out with varying degrees of hostility and disappointment. Beatrice managed a curt nod in my direction, probably calculating whether maintaining a relationship with the new owner might be financially advantageous. William shook my hand and mumbled something about hoping I would consider the family's long-term interests in my decision-making. Marcus lingered until we were alone with Harrison, his expression unreadable but his posture suggesting that he was struggling to maintain his composure. "I suppose you think this is some kind of poetic justice," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The mistreated employee getting revenge on her terrible boss." "I think it's what Theodore wanted," I replied. "He spent 40 years building something important, and he chose to leave it to someone he trusted to preserve his values." "His values," Marcus repeated bitterly. "Do you have any idea what kind of pressure I've been under? What it's like to run a company when everyone assumes you're only there because of family connections? When every decision gets second-guessed, and every mistake gets magnified?" For a moment I almost felt sorry for him. The pressure of living up to inherited expectations, the constant scrutiny, the assumption that success was unearned, those were genuine challenges that I hadn't fully considered. But then I remembered the 18 months of deliberate cruelty, the impossible deadlines designed to ensure failure, the public humiliation that had been carefully orchestrated for maximum impact. Whatever pressure Marcus had been feeling, he'd chosen to relieve it by destroying someone else's confidence and career prospects. "I understand that you've faced challenges," I said carefully, "but your response to those challenges was to make life miserable for people who couldn't fight back. That's not leadership, Marcus. That's just bullying." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the conference room windows at the city skyline where Meridian Industries had built some of its most prestigious projects. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Do I report to work tomorrow and pretend that nothing has changed? Do I call you Ms. Chen and ask for permission to make decisions? How is this supposed to work?" "That depends partly on you," I said. "Theodore gave you 6 months to prove that you can be the kind of leader the company needs. Whether you succeed or fail is largely up to you. And what kind of leader does the company need, in your opinion?" I thought about that question carefully, knowing that my answer would set the tone for whatever working relationship we might be able to establish. "Someone who values competence over connections," I said finally. "Someone who builds people up instead of tearing them down. Someone who takes responsibility for failures instead of blaming subordinates. Someone who creates an environment where talented people want to work." Marcus nodded slowly, as if processing each point against his own behavior over the past 2 years. "And you think I can become that kind of leader?" "I think you can choose to become that kind of leader," I replied. "The question is whether you want to badly enough to change behaviors that have become habitual." Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. If I might suggest, perhaps you could continue this conversation at the office. There are practical matters to discuss about the transition, and the sooner you establish a working relationship, the easier it will be to maintain business continuity. We left the law office separately, Marcus in his BMW, and me in my considerably less expensive Honda, both of us probably trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The power dynamic between us had been completely inverted in the span of an hour, and neither of us was entirely sure how to navigate the new reality. The drive back to Meridian Industries gave me time to think about what I wanted to accomplish in my new role. The personal satisfaction of seeing Marcus brought down was certainly appealing, but Theodore had entrusted me with something larger than just revenge. He'd given me the opportunity to reshape a company, to create the kind of workplace culture that would attract and retain the best engineering talent in the industry. That meant I needed to be more than just a victim who'd gotten lucky. I needed to become a leader worthy of the trust Theodore had placed in me, someone who could balance justice with mercy, accountability with forgiveness, personal satisfaction with professional responsibility. The Meridian Industries building looked different as I approached it that afternoon. Not physically, of course, but psychologically. For 18 months it had been a fortress where I was trapped and tormented. Now it was my castle, my kingdom, my responsibility to govern wisely. I parked in a visitor space rather than my usual employee spot, a small symbolic gesture that acknowledged my changed status. In a few days, I'd probably need to claim the executive parking space that came with ownership, but for now, I wanted to ease into the transition gradually. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor felt different too, carrying me not toward another day of psychological warfare, but toward my first afternoon as the owner of one of San Francisco's most prestigious engineering firms. The weight of that responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. Janet looked up as I approached the reception desk, her expression curious about my absence that morning and my early return. "Afternoon, Sarah," she said with her usual friendliness. "How did the client meeting go?" "It was very educational," I replied, which was certainly true if not entirely complete. "Is Mr. Blackwood in his office?" "He just got back a few minutes ago. He seemed a bit agitated about something. Did you want me to let him know you're here?" "That's all right, I'll announce myself." I walked across the bullpen toward Marcus's corner office, acutely aware that every eye in the department was tracking my movement. The other engineers had grown accustomed to these encounters ending in my public humiliation, and they were probably settling in to witness another round of psychological abuse. Marcus's door was closed, and I could hear him on the phone through the glass walls, his voice raised in what sounded like an argument with someone. I knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission, a small assertion of my new authority that felt both satisfying and strange. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling on carefully controlled professionalism. The phone conversation ended abruptly with a curt goodbye to whoever had been on the receiving end of his frustration. "Close the door," he said, echoing his words from our confrontation just a week earlier. "We need to talk." I closed the door and remained standing, maintaining the same position I'd occupied during countless previous meetings in this office. But everything was different now, and we both knew it. "I've been thinking about what happened this morning," Marcus said, his voice carefully modulated, "about Theodore's decision and what it means for the company going forward." "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I have a choice to make," he replied. "I can fight this, contest the will, try to prove that Theodore wasn't competent, or that you're not qualified to run a company. Or I can accept the new reality and try to work within it. What's your preference?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the portrait of his grandfather that hung behind his desk. The family legacy that he'd expected to inherit had just been given to someone else, and I could see him struggling with the implications. "Fighting it would be expensive, time-consuming, and probably futile," he said finally. "Harrison was right about Theodore's documentation. And even if I won, the company would be damaged by months of legal warfare and negative publicity." "So you're choosing cooperation?" "I'm choosing survival," he corrected. "Theodore gave me 6 months to prove myself under new ownership. That's more than a lot of people would get in a similar situation." I sat down in the chair across from his desk, a small gesture that suggested we might be able to have a productive conversation rather than another round of psychological warfare. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. I'm not interested in running this company as a vehicle for personal revenge. Theodore left it to me because he believed I could restore the culture and values that made Meridian Industries successful. That's what I intend to do. And what does that mean for my role here? It means you have the opportunity to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. But it requires genuine change, not just tactical adjustments to avoid violating the trust fund conditions. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying my face as if trying to determine whether I was offering genuine cooperation or setting a trap. What kind of changes are we talking about? The kind that addressed the systematic problems Theodore identified: the toxic management style, the hostile work environment, the prioritization of personal interests over professional competence. All of it has to change. And if I make those changes, if I prove that I can be the kind of leader you think the company needs, then you keep your job and we build something better together. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from operational procedures to personnel policies to long-term strategic planning. It was the most productive discussion Marcus and I had ever had, partly because the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically, and partly because we both understood that the company's future depended on finding a way to work together. By the time we finished, we'd established some basic ground rules for the transition period. I would begin attending board meetings and reviewing major strategic decisions, but Marcus would retain day-to-day operational control. Employee complaints about management behavior would be taken seriously and investigated promptly. The hostile work environment that had characterized my own experience would be addressed through policy changes and accountability measures. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there were still enormous challenges ahead. But for the first time in 18 months, I felt like I was working with Marcus rather than being systematically destroyed by him. As I prepared to leave his office, Marcus stood up and extended his hand in a gesture that seemed to acknowledge the new reality between us. "Congratulations on your inheritance," he said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine respect for the first time since I'd known him. Theodore chose well. I shook his hand, thinking about the long journey that had brought us to this moment. "Thank you. I hope we can both prove worthy of his trust." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of congratulatory conversations with colleagues who'd somehow learned about the ownership change, phone calls from clients expressing confidence in the company's future direction, and emails from industry contacts offering their support during the transition. Word travels fast in San Francisco's engineering community, and by 5 o'clock everyone who mattered knew that Meridian Industries had new ownership, and that the transition had been accomplished without the kind of dramatic confrontation that usually accompanied hostile takeovers. As I packed up my belongings from the cubicle that had been my prison for 18 months, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, I'd been trapped in a cycle of abuse and humiliation, counting down to what I assumed would be the end of my career. Now I owned the company, commanded the respect of my colleagues, and had the opportunity to create the kind of workplace culture that would attract the best talent in the industry. The Riverside presentation was still scheduled for the following week, but it had transformed from a desperate attempt to save my job into an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of technical excellence that would define Meridian Industries going forward. Marcus had already agreed to attend the presentation as a supportive colleague rather than a hostile critic, a change that would set the tone for all future client interactions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to prove that Theodore's faith in me had been justified. But tonight, for the first time in 18 months, I was going home from work with a sense of satisfaction and anticipation rather than dread and exhaustion. The woman who walked out of Meridian Industries that evening was fundamentally different from the one who'd entered it that morning. Not just because of the money or the power, though those were certainly significant changes, but because I discovered reserves of strength and resilience that I hadn't known I possessed, qualities that would serve me well in the leadership challenges ahead. Marcus was already proving that people could change when properly motivated. The trust fund provisions and 6-month probationary period had created powerful incentives for him to abandon the toxic behaviors that had defined his management style. Whether that change would be permanent or just tactical remained to be seen, but the early signs were encouraging. The real test would come in the weeks and months ahead, as we worked together to rebuild Meridian Industries' culture, while maintaining its reputation for technical excellence. Theodore had given us both the opportunity to prove ourselves worthy of his legacy. Success would require not just individual transformation, but genuine collaboration between two people who'd been enemies just hours earlier. As I drove home through the evening traffic, I thought about Theodore Blackwood, the man I'd never met who'd changed my life so dramatically. He'd obviously been watching the company he'd built, evaluating the people who worked there, and reaching conclusions about what kind of leadership would be needed to preserve his values. His decision to leave everything to me hadn't been random or sentimental. It had been a calculated investment in the future, a bet that the right person with the right motivation could restore Meridian Industries to its founding principles while adapting to the challenges of a changing industry. Whether I proved worthy of that investment would be determined not by what had happened today, but by what I chose to do with the power and responsibility he'd entrusted to me. The inheritance was just the beginning. The real work of leadership lay ahead. The transformation of Meridian Industries began immediately, though not in the dramatic fashion that most corporate takeovers typically unfold. Instead of sweeping changes and mass terminations, I chose a more surgical approach, addressing the cultural problems that had infected the company while preserving the technical excellence that had made Theodore's reputation. My first week as owner was spent in careful observation, attending meetings that I'd never been invited to before, reviewing financial documents that revealed the true scope of the company's operations, and conducting one-on-one conversations with employees who'd been afraid to speak honestly about workplace conditions under Marcus's regime. What I discovered was both encouraging and disturbing. The technical work remained exceptional, with Meridian's engineers continuing to produce innovative solutions to complex structural challenges despite the toxic management environment. But employee morale was abysmal, turnover in the engineering department had reached crisis levels, and several major clients had privately expressed concerns about the company's internal culture affecting project delivery. Marcus, to his credit, was making genuine efforts to modify his behavior. The public humiliation sessions stopped completely, replaced by private conversations that focused on project requirements rather than personal criticism. His interactions with junior engineers became noticeably more respectful, though I could see the effort it required for him to suppress his natural inclination toward dominance and intimidation. The most revealing conversation came during my second week as owner, when I met with Jennifer Walsh, a senior structural engineer who'd submitted her resignation the day before my inheritance was announced. She'd agreed to postpone her departure while we discussed her concerns, though her body language suggested she wasn't optimistic about the company's ability to change. "It's not just Marcus," she explained as we sat in the small conference room that had become my temporary office while I decided whether to claim Theodore's old executive suite. He set a tone that infected the entire management structure. Department heads started copying his methods, thinking that's what leadership looked like. Jennifer had been with Meridian for 7 years, long enough to remember what the company culture had been like under Theodore's direct leadership. Her perspective on the changes that had occurred provided crucial insight into how deeply the problems had penetrated. "The technical standards never wavered," she continued. "Theodore's engineering principles were too deeply embedded for that. But the human element deteriorated rapidly. People stopped collaborating, stopped sharing ideas, stopped taking creative risks, because the consequences of failure had become so personally devastating." This was exactly what Theodore had been trying to prevent when he restructured his estate planning. He'd recognized that technical competence without human decency would eventually destroy the company's ability to attract and retain the talent necessary for continued success. "What would it take to bring you back?" I asked. "Not just you personally, but the kind of workplace environment that would make you want to stay long-term?" Jennifer considered the question carefully, clearly trying to balance her desire for change against her skepticism about whether real transformation was possible. "Accountability," she said finally, "not just for technical mistakes, which we've always had, but for behavioral problems. When someone creates a hostile environment for their colleagues, there need to be consequences that actually matter." "What kind of consequences?" "Performance reviews that include management effectiveness, not just project delivery. Promotion criteria that consider how people treat their teams, not just their ability to generate revenue. Real investigation of employee complaints instead of bureaucratic dismissal." These were practical, implementable changes that could begin immediately without disrupting ongoing projects or client relationships. They also represented a fundamental shift in how the company evaluated success, expanding the definition beyond technical achievement to include human leadership. Over the following days, I met with every department head, every project manager, and every senior engineer who was willing to participate in honest conversations about workplace culture. The patterns that emerged were consistent. Fear-based management had replaced collaborative problem-solving, individual self-protection had superseded team objectives, and career advancement had become dependent on political maneuvering rather than professional competence. The solution required both immediate policy changes and long-term cultural evolution. I began with the immediate changes, implementing new procedures for employee complaints, revising performance evaluation criteria to include interpersonal effectiveness, and establishing clear consequences for behavior that created hostile work environments. The long-term cultural work was more complex, requiring patient rebuilding of trust between management and staff, demonstration that the new policies would be consistently enforced, and gradual replacement of fear with confidence as the primary motivator for professional behavior. Marcus proved to be a crucial ally in this transformation, though I suspected his cooperation was motivated more by self-preservation than genuine philosophical conversion. The 6-month probationary period and trust fund provisions had created powerful incentives for him to embrace change, but his public support for the new policies gave them credibility with employees who might otherwise have dismissed them as empty promises. The real test came 3 weeks after the ownership transfer, when David Martinez, a junior engineer in the commercial division, filed a formal complaint against his supervisor for creating a hostile work environment through constant criticism and impossible deadlines. Under the old system, such complaints had routinely disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Under the new policies, it triggered an immediate investigation with clearly defined procedures and timeline requirements. The supervisor, Robert Chen, was a 15-year veteran of the company who'd apparently learned his management style from observing Marcus during the worst period of toxic leadership. His treatment of subordinates closely mirrored the psychological warfare tactics that had been used against me, suggesting that the cultural problems had indeed infected multiple levels of the organization. The investigation took 5 days and included interviews with everyone in David's project team, review of email communications and project documentation, and consultation with HR specialists who'd been brought in specifically to handle these new accountability procedures. The evidence was overwhelming. Robert had systematically undermined David's confidence, assigned blame for problems that weren't his responsibility, and created an atmosphere of fear that was affecting the entire team's productivity. Under the old system, Robert would have received a private warning, and David would have been quietly transferred to avoid further conflict. Under the new policies, Robert was terminated immediately, with his departure explained to the staff as part of the company's commitment to maintaining professional workplace standards. The effect on employee morale was immediate and dramatic. Word of Robert's termination spread through the company within hours, accompanied by the unprecedented sight of management taking decisive action to protect an employee from supervisory abuse. For the first time in years, people began to believe that the workplace culture might actually change. Jennifer Walsh withdrew her resignation the following week, agreeing to stay and help implement additional policy reforms. Her decision prompted 3 other engineers who'd been planning to leave to reconsider their departures, stabilizing the engineering department during a crucial period of transition. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Several long-term employees struggled to adapt to the new expectations for interpersonal behavior, having grown comfortable with management styles that prioritize dominance over collaboration. 2 department heads resigned rather than modify their approaches, requiring external recruitment to fill critical leadership positions. More problematically, some clients initially expressed concern about the company's stability during the ownership transition. The commercial real estate industry was notoriously conservative, and sudden changes in corporate leadership often triggered nervous reassessments of ongoing projects and future contracts. This was where Marcus's cooperation became particularly valuable. His willingness to publicly support the new direction and his continued presence as CEO provided continuity that reassured clients about Meridian's operational stability. Whatever personal resentment he might have felt about losing his inheritance, he subordinated it to the company's need for smooth client relationships during the transition. The Riverside Tower's presentation became a symbolic test of whether the new collaborative approach could deliver superior results compared to the old fear-based system. Instead of working in isolation under impossible deadlines, I was able to collaborate with a team of engineers who contributed expertise and insights without fear of having their ideas stolen or their mistakes weaponized against them. The presentation itself was a triumph, not just because of the technical quality of the analysis, but because of the obvious enthusiasm and confidence of the team members who participated. The board members commented favorably on the collaborative dynamic and the depth of expertise that had been brought to bear on the project challenges. More importantly, the Riverside contract led to 3 additional projects worth a combined value of $32 million, as clients responded positively to what they perceived as a more mature and stable organizational culture at Meridian Industries. By the end of my first month as owner, revenue projections had improved significantly, employee turnover had dropped to levels not seen in over 2 years, and industry publications were beginning to take notice of the company's cultural transformation. An article in Engineering News Record described Meridian as an example of how established firms could evolve their management practices without sacrificing technical excellence. The success created new challenges, particularly around Marcus's long-term role in the organization. His cooperation during the transition had been exemplary, and his public support had been crucial to maintaining client confidence. But fundamental questions remained about whether his transformation was genuine or merely tactical, and whether his continued presence as CEO would ultimately help or hinder the company's evolution. These questions came to a head during the 4th month of my ownership, when Marcus submitted a formal proposal for his permanent retention as CEO, along with equity participation in the company's future growth. The proposal was professionally prepared and financially reasonable, but it forced me to confront the central tension between justice and mercy, between personal satisfaction and business necessity. The case for retaining Marcus was compelling from a purely business perspective. He demonstrated his ability to change his behavior when properly motivated, his industry relationships were valuable for business development, and his operational knowledge would be difficult to replace. Client satisfaction with his performance had actually improved during the transition period, suggesting that the new accountability measures were bringing out better aspects of his leadership potential. The case against him was equally strong from a human perspective. His 18 months of systematic psychological abuse had been deliberate and sadistic, designed to destroy my confidence and career prospects for his own entertainment. The fact that he could modify his behavior when his financial security depended on it didn't necessarily indicate genuine remorse or lasting change. The decision required input from multiple stakeholders, including the board of directors, senior staff members, and key clients who would be affected by any leadership changes. I spent 2 weeks conducting confidential conversations with everyone who had relevant perspectives on Marcus's performance and potential. The feedback was surprisingly nuanced. Employees appreciated the dramatic improvement in his management style, but remained skeptical about whether the changes would persist without external pressure. Board members valued his operational expertise, but questioned whether someone with his history of behavioral problems could represent the company's values in external relationships. Clients generally supported his retention, having observed only the improved version of his leadership during recent project interactions. But several noted that their confidence was contingent on continued evidence of professional behavior and effective results. The conversation that ultimately influenced my decision came from an unexpected source: Theodore's longtime assistant, Margaret Sullivan, who'd worked with both Theodore and Marcus for over a decade before retiring shortly after Theodore's death. Theodore believed in redemption, she told me during a lunch meeting at her suggestion. He'd made his own mistakes as a young man, and he understood that people could change if they were given proper motivation and clear expectations. Margaret had witnessed both Marcus's worst behavior and Theodore's growing frustration with his stepson's leadership style. Her perspective on the family dynamics provided crucial context for understanding Theodore's estate planning decisions. Theodore didn't cut Marcus out of the will because he thought he was irredeemable, she continued. He structured the inheritance to create conditions for Marcus's improvement while ensuring that the company would have leadership committed to the right values. So you think Theodore intended for Marcus to stay? I think Theodore intended for Marcus to earn his place through demonstrable change. The 6-month probationary period wasn't just about giving him time to adjust. It was about giving him time to prove that he could become the kind of leader the company needed. This interpretation of Theodore's intentions reframed my decision-making process. Instead of choosing between justice and mercy, I was being asked to evaluate whether Marcus had met the standards that Theodore had established for his redemption. The evidence suggested that he had, at least partially. The behavioral changes were substantial and sustained, the business results were positive, and the employee feedback, while still cautious, showed marked improvement over the previous period. Whether these changes represented genuine transformation or calculated compliance was less important than whether they could be maintained over time through appropriate incentive structures. I decided to offer Marcus a modified version of his proposal, continued employment as CEO, with a 3-year contract that included performance benchmarks for both business results and management effectiveness. Instead of equity participation, he would receive enhanced compensation tied to employee satisfaction metrics and client retention rates. The contract also included specific behavioral requirements that went beyond the trust fund provisions, creating detailed accountability measures for interpersonal conduct and leadership development. Violation of these requirements would result in immediate termination with cause, forfeiting any severance benefits. Marcus accepted the offer immediately, recognizing that it represented both validation of his transformation efforts and continued opportunity for professional growth. The 3-year timeline provided stability for business planning, while maintaining sufficient flexibility to address any regression in his behavior. The announcement of Marcus's retention was met with mixed reactions from the staff, ranging from cautious optimism to outright skepticism. I addressed these concerns directly through a company-wide meeting, where I explained the decision-making process and the accountability measures that would govern his continued employment. Leadership redemption requires both opportunity and oversight, I told the assembled employees. Marcus has demonstrated his ability to change his behavior when properly motivated. Our job is to maintain the systems that ensure those changes become permanent rather than temporary. The meeting also served to announce several additional policy changes that would strengthen the company's commitment to maintaining a respectful workplace culture. These included regular employee satisfaction surveys, anonymous reporting mechanisms for behavioral concerns, and external auditing of management practices to ensure continued compliance with professional standards. 6 months after inheriting Meridian Industries, I was able to report to the board that every metric of organizational health had improved significantly. Revenue was up 18%, employee turnover had decreased by 60%, and client satisfaction scores had reached their highest levels in company history. More importantly, the cultural transformation appeared to be sustainable rather than temporary. New employees were commenting favorably on the collaborative work environment. Industry recruitment efforts were attracting higher quality candidates, and several competitors had begun attempting to emulate Meridian's management practices. The success created opportunities for expansion that hadn't been possible under the previous toxic culture. 3 major clients offered exclusive partnerships for long-term projects, recognizing that Meridian's improved organizational stability made it a more reliable partner for complex multi-year commitments. Marcus's evolution continued throughout this period, with his leadership style becoming noticeably more collaborative and less ego-driven. Whether this change was motivated by genuine personal growth or continued self-interest was ultimately less relevant than its impact on organizational effectiveness and employee well-being. The most significant test of the transformation came during the company's biggest crisis since my ownership began. A major project in downtown Seattle encountered unexpected geological complications that threatened both the timeline and budget for a $50 million development. Under the old culture, such problems typically led to blame assignment, finger-pointing, and damaged relationships with both clients and subcontractors. Instead, Marcus led a collaborative response that brought together expertise from multiple departments, maintained transparent communication with the client, and developed innovative solutions that actually improved the project's long-term structural integrity. The crisis was resolved successfully, strengthening rather than damaging the client relationship and demonstrating the practical benefits of the new management approach. By the end of my first year as owner, Meridian Industries had become a case study in successful organizational transformation. Business schools were requesting permission to study our management transition, industry publications were featuring articles about our cultural evolution, and competitors were attempting to recruit both our employees and our clients, based on their observations of our improved performance. The personal transformation was equally significant. The woman who'd cowered in Marcus's office 18 months earlier had become a confident leader, capable of making difficult decisions about people's careers and livelihoods. The skills I'd developed during the period of abuse, particularly the ability to remain calm under pressure and think strategically about interpersonal dynamics, had proven surprisingly valuable for executive leadership. Marcus and I had developed what could only be described as a functional working relationship, based on mutual respect, if not personal friendship. The power dynamic between us had stabilized around our respective roles, rather than our personal history, allowing us to collaborate effectively on business challenges without relitigating past grievances. The ultimate validation came during the second year of my ownership, when Meridian Industries was selected as the primary structural consultant for the new San Francisco Museum of Modern Art expansion, the most prestigious architectural project in the city's recent history. The selection committee specifically cited the company's reputation for technical excellence, combined with collaborative professionalism as decisive factors in their decision. Standing in Theodore's old office, which I'd finally claimed as my own, looking out at the San Francisco skyline that included several buildings bearing Meridian's engineering signature, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this point. The inheritance had provided the opportunity, but the real work of transformation had required sustained effort from everyone in the organization. Theodore's gamble on my character and potential had paid off, not just in financial terms, but in the restoration of the values-based culture that had originally made Meridian Industries a respected name in the engineering community. The company he'd built was once again attracting the best talent, serving the most demanding clients, and setting standards for technical excellence combined with human decency. Marcus knocked on my door just as I was finishing the quarterly board report that would be presented the following week. His transformation from enemy to ally remained one of the most remarkable aspects of the entire experience, proving that even deeply entrenched behavioral patterns could be modified when the right incentives and expectations were established. The museum project team wants to schedule a celebration dinner for landing the contract, he said. They're hoping you'll join us. Of course. It's exactly the kind of project Theodore would have been excited about. He would have been proud of what we've accomplished here, Marcus replied, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine emotion. Not just the business success, but the way we've managed to change the culture without losing our technical edge. It was the closest he'd ever come to acknowledging the personal dynamics that had defined our early relationship, and I appreciated the implicit recognition of how far we'd both traveled from those dark days of psychological warfare. We've both learned a lot about leadership over the past 2 years, I said diplomatically. Sometimes the best lessons come from the most difficult experiences. After Marcus left, I returned to the quarterly report, documenting the financial and operational metrics that demonstrated Meridian's continued growth and stability. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of success was the transformation of individual lives, the restoration of professional dignity, and the creation of an organizational culture that brought out the best in everyone who worked there. Jennifer Walsh had been promoted to head of the residential division and was leading some of the company's most innovative projects. David Martinez, whose complaint had triggered the first major test of the new accountability policies, had developed into one of our most promising junior engineers. Even Robert Chen, the supervisor who'd been terminated for creating a hostile environment, had eventually found employment with another firm and, according to industry contacts, had modified his management approach based on the experience. The ripple effects extended beyond Meridian's walls, influencing industry practices and client expectations about what constituted professional behavior in engineering consultancies. Several competitors had implemented similar accountability measures, recognizing that toxic workplace cultures were becoming competitive disadvantages in an increasingly transparent business environment. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I took a moment to appreciate the view from Theodore's old windows. the panoramic vista of a city that continued to grow and evolve through the efforts of talented people working together toward common goals. Meridian Industries had played a role in shaping that skyline, and under the new leadership structure, it would continue to contribute to the city's architectural legacy for decades to come. The woman who walked out of the building that night was fundamentally different from the one who discovered those divorce papers that seemed like a lifetime ago. Not just because of the wealth and power, though those certainly provided security and opportunity that had previously been unimaginable, but because I'd learned that real strength came from the ability to transform negative experiences into positive change, to use personal adversity as motivation for creating better conditions for others. Marcus's BMW was still in the executive parking garage as I passed it on my way to my own car, suggesting that he was working late on the museum project preparations. His dedication to the company's success had become genuine rather than performative, another sign that people really could change when given proper motivation and clear expectations. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where Meridian had contributed to major residential and commercial developments, tangible evidence of the company's role in creating spaces where people lived, worked, and built their dreams. Theodore's vision of engineering excellence combined with human decency had been realized not through perfect people, but through imperfect people committed to becoming better versions of themselves. 3 years after inheriting Meridian Industries, I could honestly say that Theodore's faith in my potential had been justified. But more importantly, his belief in the possibility of redemption and transformation had proven correct for everyone involved, from Marcus to the most junior employees who'd benefited from the cultural changes. The inheritance had been the catalyst, but the real work of building something worthy of Theodore's legacy continued every day, in every project, in every interaction between colleagues who'd learned to treat each other with professional respect and personal dignity. That work would never be finished, but it would always be worthwhile. The company that Theodore had built would endure, not because it had been perfectly preserved, but because it had been thoughtfully evolved to meet the challenges of a changing world while maintaining the core values that had made it worth preserving. Sometimes the best way to honor the past was to improve upon it, creating something even better than what had come before. Marcus had kept his job not because he deserved forgiveness, but because he'd earned the opportunity to contribute to something larger than his own interests. The distinction mattered, both for his continued motivation and for the message it sent to everyone else in the organization about the possibility of genuine change. The evening traffic moved slowly through the city's streets, giving me time to reflect on how completely my life had been transformed by a single letter from a man I'd never met. Theodore Blackwood had seen something in me that I hadn't recognized in myself, a potential for leadership that had been buried under months of systematic abuse and professional humiliation. His greatest gift hadn't been the money or the company ownership, though those had certainly changed my material circumstances. His greatest gift had been the opportunity to discover my own capacity for forgiveness, strategic thinking, and transformational leadership. The woman who'd inherited his fortune had become someone worthy of the responsibility he'd entrusted to her. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.